My friend is very good at gaming, and he leads people to the Lord, and he is discipling gamers. They believe, they come to faith, they are discipled, and they are making disciples. That's a world tens of millions of young people around the world live in. We've got to transfer what we know to a younger generation who has learned to live in a new world.
Bill, will you tell us something about your background? I know you're a nomad.
Okay, my father was in the U.S. military. Moves their people quite frequently. So 9 years, 9 different schools, 9 different cities. Even as a child, I thought of myself as a nomad. Fine Christian parents. I like to joke and say I was in church every Sunday 9 months before I was born. I think my mother never missed a church service. Grew up in a strong Christian family. About age 11, an evangelist came through, preached the gospel very clearly. I recognized I wasn't saved, made a conscious decision, was baptized. I was genuinely saved. Then on through life, when I was in high school, was in a church youth group, and I told God what I wanted. I wanted to marry a beautiful wife. I wanted to fly in the Air Force. I wanted to see the world. I wanted to do exciting things. God introduced me to Susan, and after the second time I asked her, she agreed to marry me, and I had a beautiful wife. And the military officer reserve program paid my way through college, and so I was in the Air Force, and I was flying and traveling around the world and seeing exciting things. And about age 25, as a Christian, I said, God, what next? God very clearly communicated to me that he was not going to tell me what next. And then he said, very bluntly, I'm not going to tell you. And in that dialogue with God, God says, I give instructions to people who are obedient, and you've been running your own life, making your own decisions about what you want to do. And when you decide to be obedient, then I'll give you your instructions about what to do next. If you can understand the analogy of a military officer in the Air Force flying, it's like you don't entrust $1 million airplane to someone who's going to fly it wherever they want it. You entrust it to someone who's going to fly it where your commanding officer tells you to fly it.
Yeah.
And that came very strongly to my mind again. So had another event with God then in which made a full commitment, full surrender. Okay, whatever you want me to do, I'll do. Then immediately after that, I spent a year in Vietnam in the military, and then back to Washington, D.C. And then Susan and I had a prayer time, and God said, okay, it's long enough for you to be in the military, and now I want you to be a full-time missionary. And then we went to Thailand as church planters, 12 years planting churches among Buddhists in Thailand, worked with refugees, Vietnamese, Cambodian refugees, some other experiences along the way, learned the Thai language. Not a very successful or effective church planter. I mean, that was my life. And then God very distinctively told us to leave Thailand and go to China and work with the house churches. All of the things that I had learned how to do in Thailand, public preaching, build church buildings, hire pastors, open seminary, many of the other kind of things I learned how to do, all of it was illegal in China, and most of it wasn't necessary because Chinese believers were doing it better than I could have done anyway. Started at the bottom again.
Did you have any breakthrough in China?
Oh, yes, indeed. From 1974 on, my wife and I had both gone to the Lausanne meeting. We had heard Ralph Winter talk about unreached peoples. I used to write those unreached people profiles.
Yeah.
And helped with the Lausanne movement worldwide during the 70s and the 80s. So quite aware. And so God gave us a particular unreached people group that was a little bit related to the Thai. It was a large people group, about 15 million people. And over several years, mobilizing a lot of Chinese house church people, foreigners, from Koreans to South Africans to Taiwanese. Saw a movement there. Quite a few churches in 7 different dialects among that particular unreached people group.
Ralph Winter's 74 speech in Lausanne changed the course of missions, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a pivotal thing from Donald McGavran to watching John Stott write the Lausanne Covenant. But Ralph Winter really opened people's eyes to there's large people groups out there. And then about a decade later, in the 80s, Christians started flooding into Russia, India, China, these other restricted access places. And generally, there was a focus on unreached people groups.
So, what's your core ministry, the things that you're focused on?
That is a very difficult question to answer. You sent it to me, so I'm prepared, but I don't have a good answer. For a decade of my life, I was a church planter, training church planters, evangelizing, especially Buddhist unreached people group. Then the role in China for close to a decade, I learned from the house church people. I learned about movements. I got to know many of those key leaders in China that God had used to bring the gospel to millions of people. So I learned experientially there. After about a decade in China and working with unreached people groups all over Central Asia and visited a lot of other places, my agency asked me to stop doing that and to be a trainer. And so primarily for the last 30 years, I've been a trainer of people who get to movements. A lot of familiar names like David Watson or Bruce Carlton or Curtis Sargent, or just a lot of those people are folks that I've worked with in a training role around the world.
Which other countries you went, visited, and trained people in church planting?
Oh, I could not give you a full list. You've got brothers in the UK. I did 2 different 1-monthers in London, and we brought people out of the Middle East. Moscow, trained people around Russia. A number of Cyprus 1-monthers. People came out of the Eastern Med, the Middle East. Several 1-monthers in Nairobi, working up and down East Coast. The last few years, pre-COVID, a lot of trips into West Africa. In your own country, I've been working a good bit with YM Frontier Missions.
Yeah.
They got the large number of people there. So a quick answer is over the last 30 years, hundreds of places and scores of countries.
Yeah. What has been the impact of COVID on your ministry and different ministries?
Oh, it's a massive impact. The last time I was on an airplane was February a year ago, going to Nepal to do some training. Typically 6 or 8 overseas trips a year, going and living with people for a week or 2. So one impact is fewer airline miles, fewer airline meals, fewer preparation against malaria, all of that.
Yeah.
To be honest, yesterday I was coaching families in London, working with immigrant Chinese. Yesterday I was working with people that are working in South Asia. Early this morning, working with American team in Marseille, France, that are reaching Moroccans and Algerians. So in a typical day, I'm probably doing as much training as I ever used to do when I was on the road flying.
So you think the days of itinerant missionary in person has been replaced by digital virtual missionaries?
That is an excellent question. Agency people are asking that question. It's a fundamental question right now. Let me precede the answer with a couple other insights.
Yeah.
Many South Koreans, South Africans, Brits, Americans that have typically gone overseas to reside in places. Because of COVID, they came home and they're never going to go back to those places to reside there. The total number of Westerners, overseas resident missionaries has decreased drastically. And it may take a decade, if ever, for that to increase. The overseas residential Westerners has drastically decreased. Secondarily, Americans especially, thousands and thousands of short-term trips by teams, hundreds of thousands of Americans used to go overseas to do something. COVID stopped all of that.
Yeah.
And agencies are having great difficulty recruiting people to do that. Older Americans, like mature pastors, who will say, because of COVID, I will never get on an airplane again.
Yeah.
There are people who've done that for decades who are not going to go do that. One point is the total number of overseas resident missionaries has dropped drastically. This is like the most precipitous drop. I mean, compare that to, say, World War II. The number of short-term people has precipitously dropped.
Mm.
Some have learned how to do this digitally online.
Mm.
Many trainers have not learned how to do it well digitally online. It takes different skills. I'll give you an example. I'm looking at the faces of men right now on 3 or 4 continents.
Mm.
If we were face to face, I would already have stopped twice and said, turn to your neighbor and tell them what you're hearing.
Yeah.
It's just much more difficult online to have that level of interaction.
Yeah.
So it's different skills. Some of the guys used to travel training are they're not doing it online.
Yeah.
They're just not.
Bill, digital evangelism is well developed, and
Yes.
evangelism or preaching is an event that's widespread and in fact has got a big push during this period. But digital discipling is a process that takes time. I'm not sure how well that is developed digitally. People are preaching and evangelizing, but not discipling. That skill needs to be developed, owned, and practiced.
Uncle Victor, this is another key issue that agencies and missionaries are facing all around the world.
Mm.
Preaching is typically monologue, one-way communication.
That's right.
And we don't make disciples that way.
No.
Most of the disciplers I know are very comfortable with face-to-face dialogue. It's difficult for them to learn how to do it online. In the United States, many churches still have this one-way communication digitally. They are struggling how to practice everyone speaking, everyone sharing their insights from the Lord. Monologue preaching that does not have an accountability component isn't very effective for discipling. And so learning to pause, what did you hear? How did you implement last week? A lot of people did a lot of discipling faith. They're struggling how to do this online. I'm working with a number of digital agencies, right? I can tell you some stories about how they are trying to do this, but it's a real struggle.
Another difficult question I want to ask you is about the church where the pastors were confined to the 4 walls and one congregation. Now, most of these churches have closed down, and many have gone digital, and they are now preaching way beyond the 4 walls. Some, of course, have shut shop and closed down, but there's a new church that's coming up, that's come up already, a digital church. What do you think about this church?
Oh, I am very aware we only have an hour. So let me give just a few examples. I have good friends dealing with Turkey. There's a small Turkish church, had about 30 Turkish members. It was a very enclosed kind of situation there. When COVID came and they had to shut down, someone advised the pastor. He started putting his messages online, the same Turkish sermons that he was doing for his people. The last information I had, he had 30,000 viewers. A man who used to preach faithfully every week to about 30, 35 Turkish believers. In that little building, now there are 35,000 Turks around the world tuning in and listening to that same message.
Fantastic.
Okay. That's an example. I'm encountering that kind of thing all around.
Mm-hmm.
I deeply respect pastors. Some pastors are great preachers, poor preachers, this kind of thing. Now that Christians all over the world have the option, people that are poor preachers, no one's listening to them.
In India, somebody said that there are about 100,000 pastors who are in dire situation because they are totally dependent on the income from the congregations. And so now there is a need for tent makers in the next generation of pastors who are going to be successful. Most of our house church leaders are tent makers. They are Bible Christian. They earn their own living and also do their ministry. And what do you think about tent making ministry getting a big boost in the coming days?
Absolutely, it is getting a big boost, but it comes down to the individual situation. Mm-hmm. If a person has been trained to be a preacher and trained to be an administrator of a church compound or a church facility, some of them, it's extremely hard for them to decide, I want to earn my own living as a merchant, as a whatever. And there's the massive emotional block right there. Some of them have heard over and over preached at them, if you take your hand away from the plow, God won't bless you. And they interpret that as going back to secular employment. Well, I sympathize with these people who don't have job skills, who have been taught it is immoral and don't know how to turn next. I'm very sympathetic to them. It is the reality. The China House Church, many of these other large movements, just about everybody supports themselves.
Yeah. There's been a huge change. The world is not the same world that was there 20, 30 years ago. Some have a little longer history, like China and South Korea and all. But 10, 40 window countries have dramatically changed in the last 2, 3 decades.
The emphasis on getting to the least, the last, the lost, the unreached, and empowering lay people who are a bit more creative and entrepreneurial to get into those places. Years ago, back in the 1980s, I was going to Lhasa, Tibet, and negotiating contracts to get teachers in there, and then all across Central Asia. My daughter and her family were in Kyrgyzstan for a couple of years. Gene Davis's daughter was up in Uzbekistan. These were younger lay people, entrepreneurial people making a difference. The world has changed.
Bill, what's the impact among in the Muslim countries of the Great Commission?
About 35 years ago, the first movement among Muslims, modern history I'm aware of, is the Kabyle Berber up in the Atlas Mountains, Morocco, Algeria border. There's been work among Muslims for long, but the first movement, we had multiplying disciples, multiplying churches. Kabyle Berber, that was one of the real early ones. Then we started to have breakthroughs and some movements in Indonesia. Okay, so if you fast forward right now, much of what I'm doing in my focus is movements among Muslims. Pre-COVID, I was in West Africa 3 times. I mean, there's a large tribal group up in northeastern Nigeria. They're the animist and Muslims, 14,000 was the last count. Okay, to sum up Muslim speaking, in the last 3 decades, all over the globe, from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, to Indonesia, to North Africa, to little places in Yemen, there have been major multiplying movements of Muslims coming to faith. This is dramatic. For over 1,000 years, almost no Muslims are coming to faith. And now just in the last 30, 40 years, all across the globe, Muslims are coming to faith. Also, we've started seeing in the last 2 decades, movements among the majority religion where you are, Uncle Victor. Yeah. But we actually started seeing multiplying movements among caste people. Okay. And that was a very new thing. And then within the last decade in Myanmar, we're starting to see movements among Buddhists. I can think of a half dozen people there where we've actually got multiplying disciple and multiplying house church movements. So let me sum that up. In the last 30, 40 years, we've started seeing things we never saw in history. Multiplying movements among cousins, multiplying movements among the majority community in your country, multiplying movements among Buddhists. That's pretty dramatic. I mean, in the first 1,000 years of missions, we didn't see that kind of thing.
Bill, will you summarize a few points which are DMM, Disciple Making Movement multipliers, and the others which are inhibitors? Because you've been training people on these points quite a bit. So what are the accelerators and what are the inhibitors?
Okay, one of the accelerators, now I'm talking about leadership, is asking the question, how many of my people heard the good news today? It is based on a premise that if people haven't heard the good news, they're not going to become believers. Yeah. And just asking the simple question, whether you're in Hyderabad or whether you're working with a small group in some obscure place, what can I do to increase the number of people who hear the gospel today? And one of the answers is to train believers to share the gospel and to multiply shares. But an accelerator is just to ask that question. How many of my people are hearing the gospel right now? What can I do to increase the number who are hearing the gospel? Another accelerator, and it's a DMM thing around the world, but it's also whether they're talking CPM. How many of the believers that I am aware of are actively and intentionally sharing the faith? A movement multiplier is a large number of ordinary believers out sharing their faith. When I say out, I mean outside the confines of a church facility or religious institution. That's one of the easiest questions we have to track potential fruit and results in a DMM.
Mm.
How many people, ordinary believers, they can even be new believers, are out intentionally, actively sharing their faith? Those are the sort of questions that we ask. How quickly are new believers being equipped? Uncle Victor, you and I have had conversations in the past that in some traditional churches, they get saved and then they're told to sit and soak until they've matured long enough that we can trust them, teach them to go share the faith. And we say we don't want to embarrass God by having an ignorant person out sharing their faith. But the reality in these DMMs and these movements around the world, people who come to faith have a passion to share their faith with those they love. So how quickly are we equipping them and holding them accountable for sharing their faith? I'll just tell a little short story. One of the Chinese house church networks that I worked with a long time ago in central China. Okay, if one of you led me to faith right now at 20 minutes to 11 o'clock this morning, you would go back over my plan of salvation with me, and then you would ask me, Bill, who do you love? How can you share the good news that you've just received with that person before you go to bed tonight? And then they would probably have me practice what I had just prayed and what I just understood. And then tomorrow morning, they would text me or ask me, how did the conversation go?
Yeah.
And then before we said goodbye, we would pray for the salvation of that person. It's just a short story, but something that happens in DMMs, new believers are encouraged to think of who they're going to share with. They're equipped to do it, and they are held accountable immediately.
Yeah.
But those would be some all around the world common things that really speed up these DMMs. Trusting the Holy Spirit to use a new believer rather than trusting my teaching to equip a new believer.
Yeah. Like the Samaritan woman, within minutes of encounter with Jesus, brought the whole village to his feet. Like Zacchaeus, the tax collector, within minutes of Jesus stepping into his door, he has the rest of the tax collectors change.
Like the Gadarene demoniac who had just come to salvation and said, Jesus, I want to come study with you. Jesus said, no, go home and tell your people what God has done.
And now, Bill, what are the decelerators or inhibitors of DMM?
I encounter many of them. There are many of these movements, and we could talk about large numbers of these movements around the country that you're in.
Yeah.
Bringing in teachers and trainers who do not have a book of Acts or a movement ideology and asking them to train our people.
Yeah.
A decelerator that I encounter all over the world is new believers want more Bible training. New believers want to study with somebody who understands and has studied. And then you bring in someone who does not have a movement thought, and let's just say a book of Acts or a New Testament thought. And they may give good Bible knowledge, but all of the process they use slows things down. Seen it over and over again. I have a doctor's degree. I deeply respect theology. I've taught at a number of seminaries around the world. And I want to say I deeply respect my colleagues at all of these seminaries. But it's more than knowledge. It is understanding the way the Spirit works in the book of Acts, plus having more detailed knowledge. So one movement decelerator I see all the time is a good little movement that is going, and then someone who has Bible knowledge but does not understand how the Spirit moves, how multiplication happens, and they slow these things down. You see it in Bihar. I've been following Victor John's work and David Watson's work there since the early 1990s, and can think of example after example of in a district or in a particular place, we had good multiplication, there was good movement. And then some outsiders came in to be teachers, and it slowed down.
Yeah. So what's the role of culture in this? acceleration or deceleration of the DMN?
That's a great question. 30, 40 years ago, when they first asked me to start training missionaries, I spent a lot of time getting missionaries to study the culture, study the anthropology, study the worldview of these people they were going to. And I think that was beneficial. Later on, as we see more of these movements, we tell our workers, study the culture of the New Testament, understand the worldview of the scripture, get deeply immersed into that worldview, and you will probably find points of connection whoever God has sent you to. And that will protect you from bringing your Korean or your American or your Filipino or your British culture in. Currently, I see get deeply immersed into a New Testament culture, the signs and wonders, the miracles, the multiplication technique, and see the way God worked there. Find those points of contact with the new culture. It doesn't mean you go in ignorant. An example would be South Asia, Bangladesh, more than 20 years ago. A local brother was using the Quran to find points of contact with Jesus, Isa al-Masih, and he opened the eyes of many of us how to use the Quran to build a bridge to the scripture, and then from the scripture get people saved and discipled. Well, that was a cultural thing, but it wasn't a foreigner who discovered it. It was a local person that was in that culture, was touched by the gospel, and learned how to use his own culture to help many more people saved. Yeah. So one aspect that has changed in missionary training now, rather than teach foreigners so extensively about the local culture, get in, let the gospel get some people saved, and have local people who are from that culture and immersed in that culture transition the gospel into that culture, rather than a foreign expert who has studied it so much.
So we are saying that it's not Eastern culture or Western culture. It's a book of Acts culture that needs to be implemented.
Oh, absolutely. A friend of mine is the Chinese fella, Ying Kai. He and his wife, Grace, developed that training for trainers, which is really very effective in China. And so because he's Chinese, I heard him teaching a group of Americans one time who were getting ready to go in China. And he was very abrupt. He stopped them because after he had said something, one of the Americans said, our goal is to make Chinese Christians that perfectly live the Chinese culture. And Ying Kai said, no, Chinese lie, Chinese steal, Chinese don't pay their taxes, Chinese cheat their customers, Chinese don't respect their wives. He said, I don't want to make a Chinese cultural Christian. I want you to go to China and make a New Testament biblical Christian. And this was a Chinese brother who said that to an American. I mean, don't go in naively and say, I want to honor all the aspects of this Chinese culture. He said, I'm a Chinese. We steal from each other all the time. We lie to each other all the time. We work too hard. We don't take care of our families. Don't go in with the idea you're going to make a perfect Chinese Christian who lives out Chinese culture.
Bill, what are your future plans or strategies?
Every week I get contacts from others who say, can we get together? So I assume eventually it will be safe to get on a plane and go train. And I look forward to the Indian food and hug my friends. But I'm using what I've got, which is Zoom, WhatsApp, Signal, Proton Mail, and GroupMe to train people. Another answer to your question is, I'm an old man. I'm 77 years old. And I have had to learn some new things. A younger brother named Eric has discovered how to share the gospel very effectively on TikTok. Okay. I did not know much about TikTok, but I've gone to see this brother. I've met with him. I'm seeing his results. People are getting saved through his gospel sharing there. So you asked me what I'm going to do next. Right now, I am working to understand how to do discipling of people who came to faith through TikTok and using YouTube and various other interactive things. I am desperately trying to play catch up to learn how to use these tools that God has given us that 2 years ago I'd never even heard of TikTok. So what am I doing next? In the last couple of months, I've had to learn that this brother on TikTok has got hundreds of thousands of followers. Some of his things have gotten to over 1 million. So I am in a catch-up mode, figuring out how to get multiplying disciples out of these new media platforms, learning what new things God is doing. That keeps me young.
Okay, now, Bill, you have 10 minutes to give us a motivational message.
Okay. There's a little obscure people group in the Old Testament. I think they are only mentioned once in First Chronicles chapter 12, verse 32. I won't read it to you since this is a 10-minute message. It is the sons of Issachar.
That's right.
David was about to be accepted as the leader of all the people of Israel. And you have this list of all of the other tribes, how many chiefs, how many captains, how many swords, how many soldiers they had. In the midst of this list of people, the sons of Issachar are mentioned. And there's two things I would like all of us to remember about the sons of Issachar. They knew what was happening in the environment. They knew what was happening in that changing situation. And number two, they knew what to do. They did not just sit around and say the world is changing, the king is changing, the government is changing. They did not just know what was happening. They knew what to do. So here is my message to all of us. We need more sons of Issachar right now. The world is changing very quickly. People are living online. There are tens of millions of young people whose world and worldview is online, is digital. We need new sons of Issachar who know what is happening and they know what to do. I have an American friend named Jake. He spends 12 hours a day gaming, online gaming. Typically, I would say, boy, that must be sin or something else. My friend Jake is very good at gaming, and people respect him. He shares his testimony in chat boxes. He gets in audio files and leads people to the Lord, and he is discipling gamers. They believe, they come to faith, they are discipled, and they are making disciples. Okay, that's a world I don't live in, but that's a world tens of millions of young people around the world live in. And he's reaching gamers. Some are in South Korea, some are in San Francisco, some are in South Africa, some are all over the USA. Okay. He knows the times, the era we live in. Some people are only going to be reached online inside the gaming community. You have to be good at it. You have to learn how to reach people there. You have to learn how to disciple them there. And he's learned to do it. When I think of sons of Issachar, most of them are going to be much younger than all the faces I'm looking at right here. Yeah. And they're going to live in a digital world, and they're going to learn how to bring people to salvation and to multiply disciples. Mm-hmm. So men and women that I'm looking at right here, most of us understand how to make disciples. We've got to communicate that to a younger generation who knows how to live in a TikTok world, a gamer world, a WhatsApp world. Does that make sense? So my message is, brothers and sisters, it's taken decades for some of us to learn what God wants us to know about multiplying disciples. But probably none of us are going to spend 12 hours a day in the gamer world touching South Koreans, touching South Africans, touching Norwegians, touching San Francisco people, and lead them to faith. We've got to transfer what we know to a younger generation who has learned to live in a new world. So, sons of Issachar, that's my message.